On this Saturday night, China's new COVID surge that will soon test Canada. Millions travel while new variants spread. The new concerns overseas and the ripple effect here. A travel nightmare ends for some Canadians in Mexico. Plus, what El Chapo's son's arrest means for the drug trade in Canada. The U.S. House of Representatives finally picks a speaker. The humiliating 15th ballot victory.
I never give up.
The dramatic moments getting there and who the new House Speaker credits for the win.
That's my dad.
And a trip to the art gallery unlike any other.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This holiday season, we saw hundreds of thousands of Canadians travel to be with family and friends in China. The biggest travel season kicks off today with the Lunar New Year. There, the number of travelers are in the billions and bringing with them a new wave of COVID-19 concerns. Though some are taking their own precautions, this will be the first Lunar New Year without any domestic travel restrictions since the start of the pandemic, leading to a travel rush which threatens to inflame the country's already raging outbreak. Canada is one of more than a dozen countries now testing travelers from China. But as Touria Izri reports, it might not make a difference.
Millions of people in China have started crisscrossing the country for the Lunar New Year. From train rides to flights and bus rides, an estimated 2 billion trips will be made over the holiday. And as commuters move around, so will COVID-19.
This is the concern in China, is that the Lunar Year is going to spread infection to the whole of China. And therefore, the worst is still to come.
A mass exodus is underway from cities to the countryside, with passengers desperate to see family after years of separation under strict lockdowns.
My grandparents have also told me many times that they miss me a lot.
But in rural China, vaccination rates are low and healthcare is limited. We've enhanced training for medical workers in these areas, says China's National Health Commission. But hospitals in urban centers are already struggling to cope with the surge. Infections have soared since the country abruptly ended its COVID-0 policy. The World Health Organization warns Beijing is underreporting cases.
The tragedy of a government that wants to consider itself infallible. So you're not allowed to admit your mistakes.
A growing list of countries, including Canada, now require passengers from China to show negative COVID tests. But health experts believe it will make little difference.
You can slow, but you will never stop the virus or the bacteria when it's out of the bottle. It is just too many ports of entry.
In Europe and North America, an offshoot of Omicron is circulating. Subvariant XBB.1.5 is spreading rapidly in the U.S., now making up 70% of new infections in the Northeast. There are a few dozen confirmed cases in Canada, but with a lack of testing, that number is likely higher. Doctors say it's the most transmissible strain yet, but does not appear more severe.
We are fortunate in that we have a reasonably good firewall of high levels of vaccination, including now booster doses, although they're still lagging.
And getting vaccinated is the best layer of protection as the virus keeps evolving. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.
Some Canadian tourists in Mexico's Sinaloa state are checking out of their hotels and returning home after a wave of violence erupted this week, shuttering airports and prompting an advisory to shelter in place. 19 suspected gang members and 10 military personnel were killed following the arrest of Mexican drug cartel boss Ovidio Guzman, the son of notorious drug lord El Chapo. 2 airports in the region have reopened, with flights back to Canada scheduled today. Joining me now is Reuters senior correspondent David Graham, who's worked in Mexico for the past decade. David, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start with the latest on the situation on the ground right now.
Things are gradually returning to normal up in Sinaloa, but there's an enhanced military presence, obviously, because they're trying to keep things as under control as possible. The airport is reopening, has reopened, and to the best of our understanding, things are going back to normal. But clearly, the people there are pretty shocked at what's been going on.
Well, what's the latest with Guzman himself?
He is in detention. He is being held in the same maximum security prison west of Mexico City, where his father escaped in 2015. And of course, all the pending question of his extradition is being considered now, and of course will be no doubt subject to much comment in the days ahead.
This high-profile arrest is obviously a win for Mexico and for the U.S., but is it really going to make a difference in terms of drug trafficking in North America?
I think that will depend on what they do next, because clearly, you get good publicity for capturing someone who is very high profile. But I think if no steps are taken to really dry up the sources of revenue, to go after the structures of these organizations, then I think people will be skeptical about how much can be done to really halt the supply of drugs.
How will what we've seen this week, David, impact how Mexico is seen on the world stage? I mean, we know it's a popular tourist destination, but also geopolitically.
Well, I mean, obviously, while you have the good news of, from the government's perspective of capturing a high-profile target, you also have the images of the scenes we saw in Culiacan and the violence. And so, I think it will tend to perhaps harden some of the perceptions that Mexico has had to live with, that it is a place where these kind of incidents do occur. So I think, Culiacan, as it is not really a major tourist destination, but it is a big city. And, I think it will, in that sense, just remind people of what Mexico perhaps has been fairly or unfairly famous for in the last few years.
Canada's Prime Minister is going to be where you are right now, David, Mexico City, in 3 days for a summit of North American leaders. So do these events change what the three leaders are going to be discussing?
I mean, the Americans have already said that they would like to discuss fentanyl during the talks next week. And this is, of course, a synthetic opioid that's been blamed for a number of deaths, an increasing number of deaths in the US. And I think also in Canada has been, an issue. So I think it will be prominent because of the circumstances of the capture, the arrest.
Security is also going to be discussed, correct?
It will be discussed because it's a permanent topic, because it broaches, not only the issue of drug trafficking, but also the border, and immigration is always a big deal when it comes to Mexico and the US. And so that will definitely be on the agenda when they get down to business next week.
Reuters senior correspondent David Graham, thanks so much for your time and your insight. In Saskatchewan, a family is calling for systemic change in healthcare after losing a loved one to a drug overdose. Shayne Turner died just hours after he was discharged from a Regina hospital. It's a tragic loss his family believes could have been avoided, as advocates say similar patients are being failed by hospitals across the country. Connor O'Donovan reports.
We felt defeated. It feels like it's just another person of power and authority that is dismissing the addiction crisis in our province.
On November 8, 2021, Shayne Turner was discharged from Regina General Hospital after being treated for an overdose. Just hours later, he was found dead after overdosing again on fentanyl. This week, the coroner denied his family's call for an inquest, instead issuing a recommendation that the Saskatchewan Health Authority improve coordination between hospitals and detox services. But with more people dying of overdose in the province than ever before, and detox centers often full, Turner's family says opportunities need to be identified to capitalize on time spent in care in Saskatchewan.
It's a people of power and authority that have the advantage in changing the narrative for the addiction crisis in the province and are refusing to do so.
Others say more needs to be done across the country. Health Canada says in the first half of 2022, there were over 2,500 opioid-related hospital visits across the country. And while data on post-care outcomes is sparse, one 2019 study in the UK found that fatal opioid overdoses were 4 times more likely to occur in the first 2 days after discharge than at other times. This BC-based advocate says hospitals around Canada need to do a better job of ensuring the safety of those who come and go through their doors.
Dropped off onto the sidewalk or kicked out at 3 a.m. with a bus ticket and nowhere to go. I mean, it doesn't make it feel like you want to go back there and get any support.
After battling addiction for years, Guy Felicella says he's witnessed dramatic improvements at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, which has piloted programs giving overdose patients take-home Suboxone kits designed to stop cravings and prevent fatal overdoses. The hospital has also operated a safe consumption site, Pellicella adds that patients could benefit from 24/7 in-hospital access to peer recovery coaches.
It works well here for sure, and I think it could work well if it's mimicked across the provinces in Canada.
But right now, Pellicella says programs like these are few and far between in Canada, leaving patients at risk the same way Shayne Turner was.
I speak for the majority of the province when I say that we are tired of losing our loved ones when their deaths are preventable.
Connor O'Donovan, Global News, Regina.
The U.S. finally has a House Speaker after Republican leader Kevin McCarthy was voted in following a historic 15th ballot. But the bruising battle and the promises made is leaving questions about how Congress will function. Jennifer Johnson reports.
Kevin McCarthy of the state of California has received 216.
After 4 days, 15 votes, and a week filled with quarreling and chaos, Congress has elected its new House Speaker. Kevin McCarthy had to flip more than a dozen conservatives to get the votes he needed.
If there's one thing I want the country to hopefully learn about me this week is that I will never give up.
Americans haven't seen such disarray in this proceeding in over 100 years. At one point, tensions were so high, a fight almost broke out between GOP lawmakers Mike Rogers and Matt Gaetz, who led the battle against McCarthy. McCarthy was forced to broker a deal which weakens his own power, allowing a single member to call a vote to oust him from office. Democrats say McCarthy promised way too much to extremist Republicans, prompting this tongue-lashing from the House Minority Leader on what his party wants.
Reason over racism, substance over slander, triumph over tyranny, understanding over ugliness.
To get the votes he needed, McCarthy agreed to give conservatives more power on House committees, including one to investigate the, quote, weaponization of the federal government, as Donald Trump calls his ongoing investigations by the FBI and Department of Justice. McCarthy gained the speakership and made it clear who helped him to victory.
I do want to especially thank President Trump. I don't think anybody should doubt his influence. He was with me from the beginning.
The ultra-conservatives also want more investigations into President Joe Biden, his son Hunter, greater border security, abortions restrictions, cuts to some federal employees' salaries, and possibly Social Security and Medicare.
They told the American people they wanted to win the majority to fight inflation. The only thing they're fighting is each other.
This kind of fighting and a divided Congress, with Democrats still controlling the Senate, has global watchers on high alert, with everything from Ukraine war funds to trade with Canada, America's closest ally, at risk. House Republicans are promising unity, but Democrats and the president have their doubts. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
To the latest in the war. Despite a declaration of a ceasefire from Moscow for Eastern Orthodox Christmas, shelling continues today in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin committed to a 36-hour ceasefire for forces in Ukraine and said troops only returned fire when shot at by Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the attacks showed Moscow could not be trusted. Ukrainian officials also called the ceasefire a ploy for Russia to rest its forces and give them time to rearm after a week of heavy losses on its side. Canadian politics and the planet. Coming up, the province that feels it's greener than the rest and its influence on Ottawa. New internal government polling obtained by Global News is underlining how keen the people of Quebec are to see Ottawa take more action on climate change. According to the data, it's a stance more popular there than in any other province. And as David Aiken reports, since the federal Liberals have heavily relied on Quebec's support to win the last 3 elections, that zeal for all things green is almost certain to influence the Trudeau government's agenda. David Aiken now joins us from Ottawa. David.
Well, Farah, this data is from the Privy Council Office's weekly polling program. Now, it's from the summer, but was only recently released to us through an access to information request. And this data shows Quebecers easily think of themselves as Canada's greenest province. One poll question asked, should Ottawa focus more or focus less on climate change? In the rest of Canada, 48% said more, 25% said less. But in Quebec, a whopping 71% said more. Just 7.5% said less. When asked to choose between lowering gas prices or fighting climate change, a majority in the rest of Canada, 54%, said cut gas prices. But in Quebec, nearly two-thirds, 61%, said no, fight climate change. And when asked if inflation or climate change should be the higher priority for Ottawa, the pattern held again. In the rest of Canada, 41% said inflation. But in Quebec, a clear majority, 56%, picked climate change.
I think Quebec nationalism, in a way, now sees itself as being green, or the idea that Quebec is greener than other provinces has now become part of provincial identity.
The Liberals hold 35 seats in Quebec, and if they hope to repeat winning a minority government at least, they must be seen to be aggressive on the issue most important to Quebecers, climate policy.
The Liberals are approaching the environment in Quebec, knowing that it's very important for Quebecers on average, more than for people in other provinces.
And that means Quebec has an outsized influence on how the Trudeau government designs climate policies for the entire country.
I try to explain to people here that it's the reason that they take into account Quebec more than, let's say, Alberta is not just the seat count. It's that they change parties. It's a four-party system.
Now, Quebec's zeal for the environment is also a challenge for the opposition Conservatives if they hope to win a larger share of Quebec's 75 seats. Farah.
All right. That is our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Ahead, a Métis leader's calls for action on the tragedies that aren't going away. As we begin a new year, we take a look at a major issue in Canada that was once again brought to the forefront last December. Our country's missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. West Block host Mercedes Stevenson sat down with Cassidy Caron, Métis National Council president, to talk about this and the other issues her communities are facing.
Cassidy, I was really struck watching the tragedy unfolding in Winnipeg of the state that we still face for Indigenous women in this country. And the attention that their family members and daughters were able to bring by being so strong and so articulate may make the difference there. But there are many, many more women who are vanishing and who have died and have been murdered. And it just sort of goes as a blip on the radar. And as long as I've been in Ottawa, people have been talking about this issue. Why do you think it is that it feels like we're on a treadmill with it and there's commitment after commitment at various levels of government, but then we continue to see it be this incredible tragedy for Indigenous Canadians and for all Canadians that this is happening?
It's such a massive issue that permeates every corner of our society. And I think that because it is such a massive issue, it paralyzes so many people. They don't know what to do. But you're absolutely right. People have been talking about this crisis that we face in Canada for years now. And it's so unfair to family members to continue to have to go to the media and tell their stories over and over again, for it only to pick up steam for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and then for it to drop off until, again, it becomes a big news story. We've seen this happen time and time again in Canada, where Indigenous people are telling their stories. They're telling their truths, you know, with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and even most recently as a Senate report on the forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls. People are telling their stories, and it's time for Canadians, it's time for politicians at all levels to listen and to really dedicate the time, the resources, and just the care to create the change so that we can move forward in a good way.
You can catch Mercedes' full interview with Cassidy Caron tomorrow on the West Block, right here on Global. A heartwarming discovery decades in the making. Next, the amazing coincidence that reunited a Toronto woman with a cherished photograph. During a visit to the Art Gallery of Ontario, a woman noticed someone very familiar in an exhibit, her father. As Brittany Rosen reports, the discovery was not only a surprise to her, but also to her dad.
Not long after Jeanette Robinson Daly stepped foot into this exhibit at the Art Gallery of Ontario just a half hour before they closed, she was drawn to a very familiar face.
That's my dad.
In a sea of photos on display, there was her father, Prince Robinson.
There was a couple young people here, millennials around, and I was like, hey, this is my dad. They're just like, okay, whatever. But at that time, that meant so much to me. This is the old apartment.
Robinson Daly says she recognized everything in the photo taken by her mother more than 50 years ago, from the apartment near Christie Pitts Park to the man holding the trumpet. She immediately called her dad.
I said, I saw your picture in the art gallery, and he's like, what? I said, yeah, it's you. You're holding a trumpet? And he said tears came to his eyes at that time.
It's believed the photo was found somewhere in California, and to this day, Prince still has the Polaroid camera that captured it. The once forgotten moment now being displayed in the AGO's What Matters Most exhibit, which highlights everyday moments of Black family life. The creators of this exhibit went through thousands of photos that were lost all over North America and then found. They then selected the 500 that are on these walls. And given the circumstances of their discovery, they say it is extremely unlikely that someone would be able to recognize someone they know, let alone a family member.
Finding the photograph of her father, Prince Robinson, on the wall, it's like a needle in a haystack. It feels, it was such a surprise.
And more than just a full circle moment, Robinson Daly says the experience has strengthened this father-daughter bond.
Some things money can never buy, and this is one of those things.
Brittany Rosen, Global News.
What a find. And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser, and on behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's Your Canada is this plains bison at Elk Island National Park in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. We love seeing Your Canada, so please keep emailing us your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.